So I think the beauty of, especially with like anthropology, sociology, being involved in the social sciences and language as well, is that these are that the skills, abilities, the content that you learn and develop by studying these particular fields, you can use them literally every single day.
Welcome to the Open Notes podcast. Our study group includes me, Nora Mortimer. Hello, good morning or afternoon. Angela Thompson.
Hello.
And Kiana Gerhart. Our guest today is Walter Burkat. Grab a snack and your notebook. Let's begin and get ready to study. So, Walter, I hope I pronounced your last name right, and if not, you can correct me as you introduce yourself.
Sure. No. Thank you very much, Nora. Yes, no, you did pronounce my name correctly, so we're all good there. Yes. So, thank you for listening to the podcast, and it's a pleasure and an honor to be on the podcast today. I'm really excited to be here with everyone. Once again, my name is Walter Burkat. I am currently a French teacher at Reddington Township Public Schools in White House Station, New Jersey. I'm also an adjunct instructor in sociology at Centenary University in Hackettstown, which is also in New Jersey. And and as I mentioned before, right, being in both of these different fields in education, it's a great opportunity to really help students grow, like I said, not only academically, but also personally, emotionally, mentally, and hopefully make a positive impact on our world, which is, absolutely needed.
Yes. Can you tell us about your Zoom background?
My Zoom background. So I was actually debating what I was going to put for my Zoom background for some time now, and I was trying to think of what might be most appropriate for the conversation and trying to maybe better reflect who I am as a person. So I ended up choosing this particular background, which is actually a scene from Honolulu in Hawaii. So this is actually a photo that I took. When my wife and I went on our honeymoon quite a few years ago, and this is from our hotel. It overlooks the Honolulu Zoo, and in the background you can see Leahi, which is also known in English as Diamond Head, which is an extinct volcano that's on Oahu Island. I just found that this was a really beautiful scene, and it kind of reflects quite a few different things for myself. So first of all, I kind of wish I were in Hawaii right now. It would be really nice to be there. We've been busy with a bunch of other projects over the course of the summer so far, and I just happened to be going through these photos. I was like, oh, it was such a beautiful time. The weather was incredible. We made so many incredible memories when we were in Hawaii quite a few years ago. I think it also reflects, some of my interests as well. So it's very interesting. I happen to mention in the background, we have Leahi, which is also known as Diamond Head. And I think it speaks to this interesting perspective, the significance of names, the significance of labels. And I think in recent discourse, this idea of, for example, it's commonly known as Diamond Head. If you were to look at the Hawaii state, what was it? The Hawaii Department of State website, it's listed as Diamond Head, right? But there is the acknowledgement that it is also known as Leahi, right, in the native Hawaiian tradition. So, when we were in Hawaii, like I said, for our honeymoon, we wanted to take it as an experience to, not only get away and celebrate our marriage and whatnot, but we also wanted to take it as an opportunity to learn more about a culture that we were not as familiar with at that time. And I think having that experience of actually going to, once again, Diamond Head / Leahi, really being able to recognize the importance and the significance of the site for, like I said, not only people that are transplants to Hawaii, but also more importantly to the native Hawaiians that still inhabit the islands today. So it just seemed like a really beautiful scene, a beautiful scene, right? And it reflects, like I said, I think the importance of preserving a natural heritage.
Wonderful. I looking at your resume, see that you speak so many languages.
Yeah.
Even if you said like limited, I was like, okay, I think my Korean is limited, but it's like all slang or pop culture words.
That's
Um,
fair.
yeah. So I think you said you were like professionally fluent in French and you teach it. So I picked a French cafe. Not sure if it's actually in France, or if it's just inspired, but I was kind of like, okay, well, it's still a little early in the morning, still have my coffee, so I'll just reflect that in my background.
Wonderful, and so that's great. No, it's actually interesting that you brought up the proficiency aspects. So now, as it's mentioned on my resume, well, obviously native proficiency in English, right? Full professional proficiency in French, because like I said, I do obviously teach French. I also mentioned before, right, that I have the minor in Mandarin Chinese, which was actually an interesting little tidbit because when I was at Lafayette many years ago, well, maybe not many years ago, but kind of feels like many years ago. I was actually part of the first cohort that was able to earn the minor because before that, it was still a pretty relatively new program. They were still working on developing the coursework and the regulations, the requirements to develop the minor. So I was very happy that I just happened to be there at the right time, that they had all of that finalized, and I was able to earn that. So I do wish that my Mandarin were as good as my French, but it's okay. It's fine. I'm a lot better with reading it and speaking it is I'm okay with it as well. But I really do need to practice a little bit more. So there's just one little aspect there.
Yeah. I saw your resume and I saw that you have all these wonderful proficiencies and all these different languages. I'm very jealous. So I put together a little bit of like hey from Swedish, hello, from English, bonjour, hola from Spanish here,
Hmm.
안녕하세요, ni hao, and konnichiwa. So I thought Korean. I hope that's right in Chinese.
Ni hao,
And
yeah, that would be correct. Yes.
okay, we're all good. I made sure to Google beforehand. Imagine if I put something like I love dogs or and it's completely wrong. But
No, 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 you're perfectly fine. I was actually taking a look at it before. No, we're all good here. So,
and I also wanted to represent sign language as well. Hello.
oh, which is great. I actually always wanted to learn sign language, but still I got to work on that one.
Yeah, I also wish that we were all taught sign language starting from school. But
That would be a good idea. I agree with that wholeheartedly.
And actually, my in the fifth grade, my teacher, Mrs. Pinmantel, she taught our class the alphabet in sign language. And when I was in graduate school, I took a class with a woman whose professional signer didn't show up one day. And she was able to read lips, but there were some words she didn't know. I knew how to spell them. That was all I knew. I could spell the word for her. And so, yes, knowing sign language is incredibly important. I just recently found out that there are differences in sign language in different parts of the world. So somebody who does sign language in France might not understand an American signer. So anyhow, that's my little
Hmm.
sign language tidbit. Let's see, my background is an office because UTAC has collaborated with Walter in the past. And I think even though personally I'm not a fan of the open plan anything, I like walls. I do like having a space where people can collaborate. And so this looked like a good place where people could meet and talk and work together and collaborate and then go off to their separate little office and close the door. So there you go.
Wonderful.
So what motivated your interest in languages, Walter?
I would have to say that I feel as though I've always been interested in languages. Is like I said, I know maybe it sounds a little corny, but I think it's kind of true though. I would have to say that ever since I was young, as far back as I can remember, I would say maybe 4 or 5 years old, something like that. So here's a little interesting story. So I guess specifically, maybe not necessarily about as language as much, but more about different cultures and societies. When I was 4, so I grew up in a small town in New Jersey called Bellevue. So I don't live there. I don't live far from there right now, but many, many years ago, and then they still have this festival now, which is called Victorian Days, which would take place every September. Belvedere is well known in the area for having a significant Victorian heritage. It's, I believe, in New Jersey at least. It's the town with the most Victorian homes per capita within a town and municipality in the state. So with that being said, and actually it's interesting enough how this story relates because it actually has nothing to do with Victorian days itself, but they just happened to be there during that time. This festival, there was a dance troupe that basically performed Indonesian dances that happened to be in town during that time. And I remember even at that young age, I was like, oh, that sounds like so interesting. I remember talking to my mom about it. I said, well, can we go see this dance or the dance show recital? And I was just so mesmerized by the costumes that they were wearing, the dances, and just the musical selections that were provided as well. Just being very interested in things that I didn't necessarily have regular exposure to. Always just trying to find out more about the world around me. Like I said, beyond my own hometown and whatnot. And I think eventually that grew into an interest and a love and adoration for languages, trying to, like I said, go beyond my own, my Anglosphere, environment. Um, so I remember even at a young age, just trying to, with whatever resources I had, trying to learn a different language, especially at that time, we didn't really have Duolingo or anything like that, obviously. But Rosetta Stone was one of the big things at the time. And I remember that, for a couple of my birthdays, especially when I was younger, I always remember I would like ask my parents, can I have a Rosetta Stone CD for whatever language, um, and I had a couple different things like that. There was one for Spanish, one for French. And then, yeah, so I would say that in elementary school, we had Spanish and we would do that once a week. And then in middle school, I had the opportunity to take French. And since I hadn't done anything else with French at that point, I mean, other than some of the CDs or just my own learning, I was like, okay, well, I'll take French. And I loved it. And I really have to credit my French teachers at that time. So I had one teacher for middle school, Madame Bose. And then when I went to high school, I had Madame Wilkerson. And I really just grew to love the language, the culture. And I felt like when I was learning French, it felt like it was opening up new opportunities for me to understand the world from a different perspective than I was used to, like I said, being a native English speaker. So I think that is kind of what started me along this path of just, I almost kind of want to say it's like a Pokemon, like collecting, got to catch them all sort of languages. Like I said, I continued with French, obviously, at the college level. And then when I was at Lafayette, I also had the opportunity to start taking Mandarin Chinese classes, which, I hadn't had before. So interestingly enough with that, when we did new student orientation right before I started my fall semester of my first year, I had the opportunity to sit in basically a demo Mandarin class. And I remember that the professor at the time, Professor Li Yang, and she's still at Lafayette today, and she's such a great person, a wonderful mentor. And with that being said, so I took the demo class, and I was just so interested by the beauty of the language, learning more about, like I said, the culture, with Mandarin Chinese and all the different variations, varieties of Chinese. And then learning about the tones and just realizing it's like, wow, okay, you could have the same character, you could have the same word five different, said five different ways, and it means five different things, which I think, having only learned languages where, that's not really an impact, or it's not really a characteristic. It was just so astounding. I was like, okay, I need to learn more about this. So then I took my 3 years of Mandarin when I was at Lafayette, and unfortunately, I was not able to continue with classes beyond that. But I had been doing my own independent study, basically trying to maintain that. And I would say with other languages, like I said, with French, being a Romance language, I wouldn't say that it's easy, but it's easier. To learn other Romance languages. So I sort of picked up, a little bit more with Spanish, a little bit more with Italian, Portuguese, and not that I would necessarily say that I'm fluent, but there's enough similarity amongst all those languages where there's a good level of comprehension, and like I said, just opening up more opportunities.
You make a good point about the tones. I thought I was in drama, and so we would do like tongue twisters to warm up. And then I heard like not Japanese, but a Mandarin tongue twister, and it's the same character, but the different tonality is just crazy. You're like, wait, you said the same word like 12 times, and you're like, oh, that's a whole sentence. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. I was like, okay, no, I'm going to stick with my theater warm ups. Yeah.
Yeah, and well, and exactly, that's a good point because, like I said, even doing that demo class, for example, it was ma. So depending on the tone that you apply to the word ma and the character ma, right? Like I said, it means five different things. So it could be horse, it could be mother, it could be hemp, it could be a question, like a question word, question mark sort of implication. So, like I said, it's just so interesting because, for those who speak English or French or Spanish or any other language like that, we don't have that characteristic. Like there's no different, I mean, well, maybe you can understand it as a different connotation or a denotation, right? But it's not the same characteristic. It's not the same comparable situation. So,
Yeah.
like I said, it was just such a novel concept.
Hmm. Yeah, it would make our there, and there much easier to understand. Yeah.
Exactly. That is true. That is a good point.
So you're coming up on almost a decade after initially earning your bachelor's.
Yeah.
How do you use your bachelor's kind of beyond just like classes? You said you teach French, so maybe like what's the biggest takeaway from your major and time in school, applying it to the high school and middle school level?
Sure. So yeah, that's a great reminder. Like, wow, I guess it has been almost a decade at this point. It doesn't feel like it's been that long, but I was like, oh, I guess it has been. So I think the beauty of especially with like anthropology, sociology, being involved in the social sciences and well and language as well, is that these are that the skills, abilities, the content that you learn and develop by studying these particular fields, you can use them literally every single day. I think that's one thing that I really appreciate about having studied these, like I said, especially anthropology, sociology, and like I said, whatever language it may be. So, for example, and I know this is going to kind of relate more to the classes again, but I'm going to kind of expand on it a little bit. So now with the anthropology and sociology, so as I mentioned before, I'm an adjunct professor at Centenary University in Hackettstown. So I think through that experience, like I said, being able to help students who, who have never had experience or maybe have a little bit of experience with those social sciences, typically more in the realm of history. But like I said, anthropology and sociology is their own beasts. And I think it's really such an incredible experience to help these students understand, what are these fields? Why are they important? And really, in a way, it's just, it's something simple that they can do every single day. Just being a more careful observer of what they're seeing, what they're hearing, what they're reading, what they're intaking. And I find the same thing for myself too. I think before I started studying anthropology and sociology, so I know I feel like I'm kind of going on a tangent here, but really quickly, so I did not start studying anthropology and sociology until I was at Lafayette. So before that, I had heard of the terms, but I really didn't know what they were. I didn't really have any prior experience with it. I will say that my first semester, my first year at Lafayette, I took an introduction to sociology course with Professor Caroline Lee, and I credit her with helping me to sort of become initiated into anthropology and sociology. It was just such an incredible experience of, like I said, working to learn how to study and understand our world from a more critical, analytical experience, something that I really hadn't had before. And I think it really helped to sort of open up my mind to going beyond my own perspective and trying to better understand how other people think, how they feel, how they develop their own opinions and thoughts and perspectives, and really just sort of seeing the world almost as a like a I don't want to say an experiment, like a laboratory where you really get to see how society functions. Learning about theories, for example, talking about ethnographic research. And, I'm sure as you can kind of sort of see when I'm just kind of talking and talking, and talking, right? I like talking with people. I find myself to be rather garrulous. And, like I said, especially with ethnographic research, and I'm sure you probably remember seeing from my resume, my CV, I actually had the pleasure and the honor of being involved with an ethnographic research project when I was at Lafayette, uncovering a quote unquote lost neighborhood in Easton, which is in Pennsylvania. So it used to be called Syrian Town, which was a bit of a misnomer because the people that actually lived there were Lebanese. And there's a bit of a historical context as to why it was originally called Syrian Town and whatnot. But like I said, basically it was primarily Lebanese people, but there were other people from other ethnic backgrounds and sociocultural backgrounds as well. But with that being said, being part of that project, I had the opportunity to speak with former residents in the neighborhood and collect, data and research about different characteristics and attributes of that particular neighborhood. And actually, interestingly enough, with that particular neighborhood, it's actually coming up this weekend in Easton, which they call Lebanese Heritage Days, where it's one of the largest gatherings, cultural gatherings of Lebanese people of Lebanese descent in the tri-state area. So we're actually going to be going this weekend to visit and sort of, recollect, that experience and, celebrate that identity. So like I said, there's so much that you can do with an anthropology, sociology background. Like I said, not only studying, but also being able to celebrate those cultures, societies, different ways of thinking, etc.
I'd say when you were talking about like different languages and like different cultures, I feel like during my time in South Korea as an undergraduate, it really kind of turned my worldview upside down because of just how the basic language is formed, the structure and like grammar. I had to shift the way that I thought, and from there, like it was just so different. For example, in like Korean, like 저는 고양이를 like 좋아해요. I cat like. So that doesn't make sense at all in English. But I had to, in a way, turn off my English brain to learn this language. And it's just so interesting how we don't really think of those things unless we go out of our way to make ourselves uncomfortable. So how did you, especially with so many languages that you're learning, Chinese, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, and Mandarin Chinese and French, how did you make yourself not feel uncomfortable to learn these cultures, these languages, and be open to that?
Ooh, that's a good question. I would have to say that I think I just kind of dove in head first and I really enjoyed the experience. So, as I mentioned before, I had a little bit of experience with Spanish back in elementary school, but, at the elementary level, it's more of like once or twice a week on a cart, that sort of thing. So, like I said, I think with middle school, it became a little bit more formalized because it was a class that we had every day. And, like I said, we saw our teacher every day, we practiced every day. So it felt a little bit more, I think, tangible in that aspect. And you really need to invest the time. So I think it's at least for me, I see it as an investment, not only as an academic pursuit, but as a social pursuit, as a personal growth pursuit. And I think it's a good opportunity to learn about, like I said, a different culture, different society, different way of thinking. The interesting that you mentioned before about the grammatical structure of, say, Korean, for example, and it's a very similar idea, in Mandarin. There's also, the grammatical differences and nuances, say, in French, even versus like, say, French and Spanish or French and Italian, French and Portuguese, or any other number of languages. So I think in that perspective, in that sense, it's really interesting. I remember at the very beginning, more so the grammatical difference, but I think you also see it in the vocabulary as well. And I'll just say French, for example, just because Typically the French that you're going to be learning, say in a middle school or high school in the United States, is more metropolitan French that's spoken in France. But I have also tried to make a more concerted effort, for example, in my classroom, to introduce students to Quebecois French, maybe Haitian French, the Haitian Creole, and French that's spoken in other parts of the world, just so that students can see not only how widely spoken French is around the world, but also to better understand the cultural nuances that impact French. So, with that being said, so with French, obviously the history with France and French colonialism from hundreds of years ago up until recently, as say the 1950s, 1960s, right? Obviously there's a complicated history, right? There you have the supposed benefits, the supposed consequences, right? And however you may take that, right? French, like the language of the French language, French culture, right? And the historical legacy of all of that still impacts a lot of these regions today. So it's interesting, like I said, that the language, whether it's French, Spanish, whatever it may be, right? It's not only about the language, but it's about, like I said, the history. It's about the culture, that significance of understanding cultural blends.
So, how do you juggle it all, Walter, between teaching at the high school level and then also teaching at the college level? How do you juggle? How do you manage your time with the different audiences?
Okay, so it definitely took me time to figure out how to more appropriately, more effectively manage my time and my not only my time, but I think the personalities, maybe the perspectives that I hold in each of those places, just because I assume this as well, right? The way that I would teach or that I would instruct at the K through 12 level is going to be a little bit different, maybe pretty different as opposed to say at the college university level. And I mentioned this before too, right? That I mean, I think there's an element of building relationships in all of those aspects. So, because if you really can't connect with your students, you can certainly teach them, you can certainly instruct them, but at least in my experience, I don't feel as though they get the full message. They don't get the full picture if they can't connect with you. You're just sort of a person talking at them. They might see it that way, or that you're just there as, as your job or as your profession. So, especially at the K through 12 level, like I said, I try to find that healthy balance of the academic rigor and also the social emotional aspect as well. Interesting enough, even just with just for example with the K through 12 aspect, I'm really involved with the extracurricular activities, and like I said, building up a relationship with the students outside the classroom in order to like I said, help them grow and develop as growing human beings and adolescents and going into adulthood. And like I said, being able to hopefully expose them to things, for example, like these different cultures and different ways of thinking, ideas, maybe that I didn't necessarily have when I was growing up in the same aspects. So I think there's kind of an element of mentorship there. And then when I'm at the college and university level, obviously a little bit of a different case, right? Because you have adult learners, right? And I do find that there's an element of mentorship there as well. And I think, that mentorship may present differently, but, helping students to find, at least in my experience, helping to find the relevance of that academic background in anthropology, sociology, well, and we touch upon language as well, right? How do you apply that in the quote unquote real world? So, like I said, there are the different expectations regarding both of those different realms. And then I guess maybe a little bit more in terms of the logistics. Like I said, it took me maybe not a long time, but it took me time to figure out, okay, well, I have to balance my expectations and my workload here at the K through 12 realm, and then also with the college university realm. Like I said, being really on a strict regimen in terms of like, okay, so I need to devote this amount of time to appropriately instruct and educate students in this realm, and then also like I said with college and university, same idea. Maybe I'll think of some other things in a little bit, so maybe if there's another question, I'll have to think about that one a little bit more.
There is, it kind of relates to a course that you teach. We saw careers in sociology. You have worked with us to create an EP or an engagement package for sociology careers. So can you tell us why it's important to maybe have a whole semester dedicated to discovering careers?
Of course. So I really in particular love the careers and sociology course. And I mean, I like all the courses that I'm teaching or I have taught in the past. But I find that the careers class is a really eye-opening one because I think it's a good opportunity for me, like I said, to speak with students, like I said, my adult students who are in the midst of preparing for, graduation, either maybe continuing with graduate education or pursuing career ambitions, whatever it may be. So it's not the typical course where it feels more like the delivery of content, maybe the debates and discussions, and then, maybe like an examination, papers and whatnot. There's an element of that with this course as well, but it feels more like a practicum style. So for example, in this course, I'll have my one-on-ones with students. We'll chat about their particular career goals and ambitions, how they hope to use sociology, anthropology in their future career pursuits. And we also talk about, like I said, even just some of the logistical issues of like developing a resume, developing maybe a CV, developing cover letters, developing LinkedIn profiles, things like that. We work on interview skills. But we also talk about social theories as well, talking about, for example, how do we build and create identities related to our jobs and to our professions? And at least in my professional opinion, thinking about how many in the United States or even just the Western world in general, right? We sort of construct our identities around this idea of what we do and not necessarily who we are. And I guess maybe more in the United States. We'll just stick with that for right now. Like, so, if you think about, for example, if you introduce yourself to someone for the first time, and one of the first questions that will usually come up in that little exchange is, oh, what do you do? I'm a teacher, I'm an educator, I'm an engineer, I'm a doctor, whatever I am, right? So it's kind of interesting that even though, like I said, it's a significant part of our lives, it's not everything. But I think, at least in this context, we base so much of our worth around what we do. So I think it's obviously worth studying. It's obviously worth noting and observing what are the characteristics, what are the attributes that we look for, and maybe potentially feeling fulfilled in our careers or job ambitions. So like I said, I know I feel like I'm kind of on a tangent again, but I think the careers class is such a great opportunity for not only the students, but for myself to sort of have that reflective moment and think, oh, you know what? Like, okay, this is why I do what I do. And this is why we need to be a little bit more analytical, a little bit more critical in our thinking about, well, a job isn't necessarily just a job, right? Maybe in some cases it might feel that way, but I think if you try to understand it from a more anthropological, sociological perspective, right, then it becomes more. It's a great experience. Like I said, I really get to, work one-on-one with students. Like I said, it feels more like a practicum workshop rather than a traditional course, which I think makes it feel it's more engaging for me. I think I enjoy it a lot. It's a lot of fun. And the students always have very positive feedback saying it's like, oh, I was thinking it was going to be more like in the style of like, oh, like what can you do with your degree? Like I can become a teacher, I can become a social worker, I can become involving local government, I could do this, I could do that. And there is an element of that, but like I said, it's a much deeper conversation than I think they initially thought it was going to be. Is I remind them of how global the language French really is. So I think it's an exercise in understanding that the world is not necessarily just their community or their county, their state, or even their country, right? They're part of a global society, right? Even if they don't necessarily always actively engage with it,